0135 hours, August 8, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. First Lieutenant James Reed crouches in the kunai grass, sweat pooling in the hollow of his collarbone as he counts yellow tablets in the palm of his hand. 12 atabrine pills, 12 men in his squad. The humidity sits at 90%, thick enough to taste, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the perimeter, mosquitoes hum like a distant engine that never stops. Reed's fingers work methodically through the medical pouch strapped to his belt, the same leather case his instructors at Quantico had dismissed as field medic fantasy. Too much weight, they'd said. Too much complexity for men who needed to move fast and shoot straight. Marine doctrine was simple: rifles, bayonets, close with the enemy at dawn. Nobody mentioned that the jungle might kill you before the Japanese ever got the chance. The malaria pills catch what little moonlight filters through the canopy as Reed places one in each man's palm, watching them swallow under his direct supervision. Protocol: every morning at 0135, every evening at 1800 hours. The yellow dye stains their teeth, turns their skin the color of old brass, but Reed has seen the alternative in the medical reports trickling back from New Guinea. Japanese units losing 75 to 90% of their strength to sickness, entire battalions reduced to walking skeletons, too weak to hold their rifles steady. In the distance, the Lunga River moves like black oil between the trees, and Reed knows what's breeding in those stagnant pools. Anopheles mosquitoes. Female. Pregnant with Plasmodium parasites. Each one a microscopic bullet designed to turn a healthy Marine into a fever-racked casualty who can't tell friend from enemy when the shaking starts. Reed has counted the enemy's strength in his field notes. 2,000 cases per 1,000 men per annum in untreated units. Mathematics? That meant death. But tonight feels different. Tonight, Reed's squad moves through their pre-dawn routine with the precision of men who've made peace with science. Private Morrison checks the DDT spray canister mounted on his pack, the white powder coating already dusted across 15,000 square meters of their defensive perimeter. Corporal Hayes inspects mosquito netting with the same attention he gives his rifle bore. This isn't Marine doctrine. This is something else entirely. 0700 hours. Contact. The Japanese come across the Lunga River beachhead in small boats, exactly 300 meters from Reed's position, their movements sharp against the morning light filtering through the jungle canopy. Reed counts 37 enemy soldiers, maybe more in the second wave, their khaki uniforms dark with sweat and river water. Standard infantry assault, textbook approach for taking Henderson Field. Reed's Marines open fire from concealed positions, M1 Garand rifles cracking in measured 8-round clips while the Browning automatic rifle chews through the advancing formation. But Reed isn't watching the enemy. He's watching his own men. Private Kowalski, who took his atabrine dose 18 hours ago, holds his firing position steady despite the 102-degree heat. Corporal Martinez maintains rate of fire even as mosquitoes swarm around his foxhole. No shaking, no fever dreams, no collapse. The engagement lasts 14 minutes. When the gunfire stops, Reed counts the cost. 2 Marines down with heat exhaustion, both conscious and coherent. 0 malaria casualties. 0 men lost to the microscopic war that's supposed to own this jungle. Reed pulls out his medical log, records the numbers in precise block letters. Atabrine doses issued past 48 hours, 12,000 tablets. DDT coverage, 15,000 square meters. Unit combat effectiveness, 95%. The Japanese dead float face down in the Lunga River. 37 men who crossed an ocean to die in a foreign jungle. But Reed knows the real enemy isn't the men with rifles. It's the thing they can't see, can't shoot, can't bayonet. The parasite that turns blood into poison and strength into weakness. Reed closes his log and looks toward the tree line where more enemy boats will come tonight, tomorrow, next week. The Japanese don't know it yet, but they're not just fighting Marines anymore. They're fighting Marines who've made an alliance with chemistry itself. Marines who swallow yellow pills like communion and spray death from aerosol cans. The jungle that was supposed to kill them has become their weapon. By the 3rd week of September 1942, Reed's medical log showed patterns that made his hands shake when he wrote the numbers. Not from fever, from recognition. The weekly malaria incidence among untreated units had spiked to 2,500 cases per 1,000 men per annum, which meant soldiers were getting infected multiple times, their bodies burning through one bout of fever only to collapse into the next. But Reed's battalion held steady at 236 cases per 1,000. The yellow pills worked. Reed's role expanded beyond counting tablets and checking temperatures. Major General Alexander Vandegrift himself had pulled Reed into the command tent at Henderson Field, spreading reconnaissance photos across a field table while the generator hummed in the background and cast harsh shadows across intelligence reports. Vandegrift's weathered face showed the strain of command in a place where the enemy came from two directions, across the water in destroyers and up from stagnant pools in microscopic swarms. The general's finger traced supply routes on the map, then stopped at a series of aerial photographs showing Japanese positions along the northern coast of Guadalcanal. "Lieutenant, your medical patrols are now strategic assets," Vandegrift said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would save or damn thousands of men. "Every Marine who stays healthy is a Marine who can fight. Every unit that maintains strength is a unit that holds territory. The Japanese don't seem to understand this equation yet." Reed studied the photographs, noting the abandoned Japanese positions, the supply dumps that intelligence marked as empty, the defensive lines that aerial reconnaissance reported as undermanned. The enemy was dissolving from within, their combat strength bleeding away one fever at a time. Japanese records that would surface after the war would show 9,000 men dead from disease alone on Guadalcanal, their bodies buried in jungle graves that no rifle had dug. The Winthrop Chemical Company's factory floor in Rensselaer, New York, ran 24 hours a day, producing atabrine tablets in quantities that defied peacetime imagination. 1.8 billion doses in 1943, 2.5 billion in 1944. Each yellow tablet weighed exactly 65 milligrams and contained enough quinacrine hydrochloride to keep malaria parasites from completing their reproductive cycle in human blood. The production line moved with industrial precision, workers in white coats filling bottles that would travel 8,000 miles to reach men crouching in foxholes, where the air temperature never dropped below 80 degrees and the humidity made breathing feel like drowning. Reed coordinated with Marine Corps engineers who treated DDT application like an artillery barrage, systematic and overwhelming. They mapped every stream within 2 miles of Henderson Field, marked every stagnant pool where mosquito larvae clustered in brown clouds beneath the surface tension, then deployed teams with backpack sprayers who moved through the jungle like exterminators preparing for war. The compound killed adult mosquitoes on contact and left residual toxicity that prevented eggs from hatching for weeks. 15,000 square meters of perimeter received treatment every 72 hours, creating a chemical barrier that separated the Marines from the microscopic army that had ruled these islands for millennia. Japanese command structure lacked the logistical framework to enforce similar measures. Their supply lines stretched from Rabaul through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines and aircraft, creating a tenuous lifeline that delivered ammunition and rice, but rarely included medical supplies in sufficient quantities. Japanese soldiers received orders to take anti-malarial precautions, but without centralized distribution of prophylactic drugs or systematic vector control, individual discipline became the only defense against biological warfare they couldn't see coming. Reed's December report to division headquarters contained numbers that told the story of two armies fighting the same war with different weapons. His battalion's malaria incidents had dropped to 36 cases per 1,000 men per annum, a rate that meant fewer than 4 men out of every 100 would spend significant time in medical care due to mosquito-borne illness. Intelligence reports from Japanese prisoners and captured documents painted a different picture entirely. Enemy units reported effective strength below 10% in many sectors, with hospital areas overflowing with men too weak to hold rifles, much less mount coherent attacks against reinforced Marine positions. The human cost revealed itself in the casualty evacuation stations Reed visited as his coordination duties expanded across the division's area of operations. American stretchers carried men with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and the occasional heat exhaustion case. Japanese stretchers, when they existed, carried men whose bodies had been consumed from within by parasites that turned their blood into breeding grounds for the next generation of infection. Reed watched captured Japanese medics work with supplies that wouldn't fill a single American aid station, treating patients whose tropical ulcers had advanced beyond any possibility of field treatment. One particular briefing in late December burned itself into Reed's memory with the clarity of trauma. Intelligence officers had compiled casualty reports from a Japanese regiment that had landed on Guadalcanal in August, with approximately 1,200 men. By December, fewer than 300 remained fit for duty, and combat action accounted for less than 30% of their losses. The rest had simply melted away, one fever at a time, until entire companies existed only on organizational charts while their foxholes stood empty in defensive lines that could no longer be defended. Reed realized that major engagements now tilted not because of superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but because one side could field healthy men while the other fielded walking casualties who lacked the physical strength to execute even basic military tasks. American units rotated fresh Marines into combat positions every 6 to 8 weeks, maintaining peak effectiveness, while their opponents grew steadily weaker with each passing month. Japanese defensive positions that looked formidable in aerial photographs crumbled under assault from Marines who possessed the energy to advance, the coordination to maintain suppressive fire, and the endurance to exploit breakthroughs that exhausted defenders couldn't seal. The strategic implications crystallized during a January intelligence briefing when Reed examined captured Japanese supply requests that read like medical emergency reports. Units requesting immediate evacuation of fever cases, companies reporting strength at 20% of authorized levels, regiments unable to maintain perimeter security due to insufficient healthy personnel. The Japanese military machine, renowned for discipline and endurance, was collapsing under biological pressure that American forces had learned to neutralize with industrial chemistry and systematic application of medical doctrine. Reed closed his final report of 1942 with numbers that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Atabrine compliance in his division approached 98%. DDT coverage extended across every tactical position within the Marine perimeter. Combat availability remained above 90%, despite operating in environmental conditions that historical precedent suggested would devastate any military force within weeks of deployment. The jungle had become an ally to American forces and remained an executioner for their enemies. The war in the Pacific had acquired a new dimension, fought with tablets and spray cans rather than rifles and artillery. Victory belonged to whoever could master the microscopic battlefield first. Reed stepped off the LST onto the makeshift dock at Leh in March 1943, his boots hitting planking that flexed under the weight of supply crates marked with chemical company logos and medical corps designations. The Huon Peninsula stretched inland through jungle that looked identical to Guadalcanal but carried the stench of something different, decay on a scale that made the air itself feel contaminated. Intelligence reports had tracked the Japanese 18th Army since its formation the previous November, a force that began with 140,000 men and now existed more as a medical emergency than a military threat. The supply manifest Reed inspected contained numbers that told the story of industrial warfare fought with chemistry instead of explosives. 60,000 Atabrine tablets in waterproof containers, 47 cases of DDT concentrate, medical equipment sufficient to maintain 3 battalions at full strength for 90 days of continuous operations. Each item represented lessons learned in blood and fever on previous battlefields, codified into doctrine that treated disease prevention as seriously as ammunition supply. Reed's new assignment placed him at the intersection of intelligence gathering and medical logistics, coordinating supply distribution while analyzing enemy strength reports that painted a picture of systematic collapse. The 18th Army had scattered across New Guinea's northern coast, occupying defensive positions that aerial reconnaissance photographed but ground patrols found increasingly empty. Japanese supply lines from Rabaul had been severed by Allied interdiction, reducing enemy rations to 900 calories per day while eliminating access to quinine and field sterilization equipment that might have slowed their medical deterioration. The captured Japanese medical log that Reed examined in the intelligence tent contained entries written in careful characters that recorded catastrophe with bureaucratic precision. Unit strength reports showed companies reduced to platoon size, hospital areas overflowing with patients whose symptoms matched every tropical disease that thrived in humid, environments where sanitation had collapsed and nutrition had failed. The final entries, dated weeks before the document's capture, listed effective strength at less than 20% of authorized levels. Reed walked the perimeter of the American base and observed the contrast that defined this new phase of the Pacific War. Marines moved through their duties with the efficiency of men whose bodies functioned normally despite environmental conditions that should have reduced them to hospital cases within weeks. Morning sick call produced fewer than 50 cases per 1,000 men, most involving minor injuries or digestive problems that resolved with rest and proper hydration. The yellow tinge of Atabrine prophylaxis marked every face, but the men who carried those chemical signatures also carried their weapons with steady hands and maintained alertness that spoke to intact nervous systems unburdened by parasitic infection. American hardware reflected the same systematic approach to tropical warfare that characterized their medical protocols. M1 Garand rifles received daily cleaning that prevented jungle humidity from corroding firing mechanisms. Browning automatic rifles functioned reliably because their operators remained coherent enough to perform preventive maintenance. Sherman tanks deployed to selected island operations maintained mechanical readiness because their crews possessed the physical strength and mental clarity needed to execute complex maintenance procedures in hostile environments. The intelligence briefing Reed attended on the 15th of March contained reconnaissance data that quantified the enemy's dissolution in terms that made clear why major engagements had shifted from tactical contests to exercises in occupying abandoned positions. Japanese Unit X, originally consisting of 1,200 men, reported only 300 fit for duty. 70% of their casualties resulted from disease rather than combat action. Similar reports arrived from across the theater as American forces advanced against positions that crumbled before contact because their defenders lacked the physical capacity to fight. Reed visited the casualty evacuation station, where the implications of biological warfare revealed themselves in human terms that statistics couldn't convey. American stretchers carried Marines wounded by enemy fire, men whose injuries resulted from military action rather than medical neglect. Japanese prisoners arrived in conditions that spoke to weeks or months of systemic failure. Tropical ulcers had advanced beyond field treatment. Malaria had progressed through multiple cycles, leaving men whose fever responses had exhausted their ability to regulate body temperature. Dysentery had dehydrated patients to the point where conscious thought required tremendous effort. The Japanese medical orderly, who spoke enough English to communicate with Reed's interpreter, described conditions that amounted to medical collapse on a scale that overwhelmed any possibility of military effectiveness. Hospital areas lacked basic sanitation. Medicine consisted of whatever plant materials local knowledge suggested might provide relief. Food supply had degraded to the point where caloric intake couldn't sustain basic metabolic functions, much less the energy demands of combat operations in tropical heat. Reed examined aerial photographs of Japanese defensive positions and saw the physical evidence of biological defeat written across terrain that should have provided formidable obstacles to American advancement. Bunkers stood empty because their occupants had become too weak to climb into fighting positions. Supply dumps contained ammunition that would never be fired because the men assigned to fire it lay unconscious in improvised medical facilities. Defensive lines that looked impressive on tactical maps had gaps that resulted not from enemy action, but from units that no longer existed as functional military formations. The captured Japanese officer, who provided the most detailed intelligence about enemy medical conditions, spoke with the detached precision of someone describing events that exceeded normal human experience. His unit had watched 75% of its strength disappear over 6 months without significant combat contact. Men had simply weakened until they could no longer perform basic military tasks, then weakened further until they could no longer care for themselves, then died in numbers that overwhelmed burial details that were themselves too weak to dig proper graves. Reed's final assessment, submitted to Division Headquarters on March 28th, contained conclusions that redefined victory in the Pacific Theater. American forces no longer needed to defeat Japanese units through superior firepower or tactical innovation. They needed only to maintain their own health while occupying territory that their enemies could no longer defend. The 18th Army existed on organizational charts, but had ceased to function as a military threat. Disease had accomplished what conventional warfare might have taken months of bloody fighting to achieve. The strategic implications crystallized as Reed reviewed intelligence summaries from across the Pacific. Japanese defensive positions were collapsing from within, creating opportunities for American advancement that required little more than the ability to walk into abandoned enemy territory and claim it. The war had acquired a new dynamic where victory belonged to whoever could survive the environment long enough to occupy it. Reed closed his report with numbers that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. American units maintaining 90 to 95% availability, while their opponents existed more as medical emergencies than military threats. The jungle had chosen sides. Reed's new headquarters in Noumea, New Caledonia, occupied a converted warehouse where shipping containers lined concrete. Floors in neat rows, each one containing chemical weapons that weighed less than a standard rifle cartridge. By late November 1943, the logistics of keeping American forces healthy had evolved into an industrial operation that dwarfed conventional ammunition supply in complexity and exceeded it in strategic importance. Reed coordinated the movement of atabrine tablets, DDT concentrate, mosquito netting, and larvicide to forward bases across the Southwest Pacific, tracking man days lost to illness, with the same precision that ordnance officers tracked artillery rounds and fuel consumption. The numbers that crossed Reed's desk told the story of two armies fighting the same war with fundamentally different approaches to biological reality. Army records documented 47,663 malaria cases in the Southwest Pacific area during 1943 alone. But those raw figures concealed the crucial detail that separated strategic success from medical catastrophe. American units that maintained strict prophylaxis protocols and systematic vector control now reported incidence rates below 50 cases per 1,000 men per annum, while units that had relaxed medical discipline during the early months of the campaign showed rates 10 times higher. Reed's daily routine involved reviewing supply manifests that contained items no peacetime military had ever considered essential combat equipment. Winthrop Chemical Company's production reports showed 2.5 billion atabrine doses manufactured in 1944, enough to supply every American soldier in the Pacific Theater with daily prophylaxis for 3 years of continuous operations. DDT production figures reflected similar industrial scaling, with chemical plants delivering tonnage quantities of insecticide to forward areas where Marine and Army units supplied it with the systematic thoroughness of men whose lives depended on eliminating every possible mosquito breeding site within operational perimeters. The logistical complexity extended beyond chemical supply to encompass training programs that treated medical discipline as seriously as weapons maintenance. Reed oversaw the development of standardized procedures for atabrine distribution that eliminated the possibility of individual non-compliance through direct supervision and documentation systems that tracked every dose issued to every man in every unit. Mosquito net inspection became a daily ritual performed with the same attention to detail that Marines applied to rifle cleaning. DDT application followed maps that marked every stream, pool, and drainage ditch within 2 kilometers of American positions. Intelligence reports from captured Japanese documents revealed the strategic implications of this systematic approach to tropical medicine. The 18th Army's strength reports, when they existed at all, described military formations that had ceased to function as combat effective organizations. Units reported 20 to 30% of nominal strength due to disease, starvation, and exhaustion, with some formations degraded to the point where they could not maintain perimeter security, much less mount offensive operations. The term combat ineffective appeared in American intelligence summaries with increasing frequency as Japanese positions were abandoned not due to tactical pressure, but due to insufficient healthy personnel to occupy defensive positions. Reed's medical log documented the contrast with precision that made clear why American forces could sustain offensive operations while their opponents struggled to maintain basic defensive postures. Sick call days per 1,000 men had dropped from 250 in early 1943 to fewer than 50 by March 1944 in Reed's area of responsibility. Meanwhile, Japanese prisoner interrogations revealed conditions that amounted to medical disaster on a scale that overwhelmed any possibility of military effectiveness. Enemy units existed more as collections of patients than as fighting formations. The industrial infrastructure that supported American medical superiority operated on a scale that defied peacetime imagination, but reflected wartime priorities that treated soldier health as a strategic weapon. Winthrop Chemical's factory floor in Rensselaer ran continuous production shifts to meet Pacific Theater demand for anti-malarial drugs. Chemical plants across the United States retooled production lines to manufacture DDT in quantities sufficient to treat every American base, airfield, and supply depot in the tropical Pacific. Pharmaceutical companies coordinated with military logistics to ensure that medical supplies reached forward areas with the same reliability as ammunition and fuel. Reed's coordination responsibilities expanded to encompass liaison with Australian Medical Corps units who had implemented similar prophylaxis protocols and achieved comparable results in their area of operations. Combined Allied forces now maintained aggregate strength levels above 90%, despite operating in environmental conditions that conventional military wisdom suggested would reduce any army to hospital cases within weeks of deployment. Japanese forces in the same geographic areas reported strength levels below 20%, with many units functionally non-existent due to medical collapse that preceded any significant combat contact. The strategic situation had evolved beyond conventional military competition to encompass biological warfare in which victory belonged to whichever side could master the microscopic battlefield first. Reed examined intelligence photographs of Japanese defensive positions that looked formidable from aerial perspective but contained insufficient healthy personnel to man the weapons that remained in abandoned bunkers. Supply dumps held ammunition that would never be fired because the soldiers assigned to fire It had been evacuated to medical facilities that lacked the resources to treat tropical diseases at epidemic scale. Reed's assessment reports documented the transformation of Pacific theater operations from tactical contests between opposing military forces to exercises in occupying territory that had been abandoned due to medical rather than combat casualties. American forces advanced against defensive lines that crumbled from within, seizing objectives that required little more than the physical ability to walk into positions that their enemies could no longer defend. The 18th Army's nominal strength of 140,000 men had been reduced to fewer than 13,000 effective combatants, with the remainder evacuated, hospitalized, or dead from diseases that American forces had learned to neutralize through industrial chemistry and systematic medical discipline. The captured Japanese medical officer who provided the most detailed intelligence about enemy conditions spoke with the clinical detachment of someone describing events that exceeded normal human experience. His unit had watched 90% of its strength disappear over 18 months without major combat action. Men had weakened progressively until basic military tasks became impossible, then weakened further until personal care required assistance from comrades who were themselves too sick to provide meaningful help. Death rates exceeded the capacity of burial details to dig graves, leaving bodies that attracted insects and accelerated the spread of diseases that were already endemic throughout Japanese-controlled areas. Reed closed his final assessment of 1943 with conclusions that redefined victory in the Pacific War. American forces had achieved strategic dominance not through superior firepower or tactical innovation, but through the systematic application of medical knowledge that treated disease prevention as a force multiplier equivalent to air superiority or naval control. The Japanese military machine, renowned for discipline and endurance, had been defeated by enemies too small to see, but powerful enough to reduce the finest soldiers in the world to walking casualties who posed no military threat to anyone. Victory belonged to whoever could survive the environment long enough to claim it. Reed arrived at Cape Womb on June 15, 1944, stepping onto beach sand that mixed with the ash of funeral pyres that had burned continuously for 3 months. The Japanese 18th Army had retreated along New Guinea's coast like a medical evacuation in reverse, leaving behind positions that American forces occupied without firing a shot, because the defenders had evacuated themselves to die in jungle hospitals that lacked medicine, food, or hope. The stench of tropical decay hung in the air with the weight of industrial disaster, the smell of an army that had rotted from within while its weapons rusted unused in abandoned bunkers. The Australian Medical Corps captain who briefed Reed spoke with the clinical precision of someone who had documented catastrophe on a scale that exceeded normal medical experience. Japanese units surrendering in the area arrived in conditions that challenged every assumption about human endurance and military discipline. Men who had once represented the elite of Imperial Japanese Army training now stumbled through surrender procedures with the coordination of patients in advanced stages of neurological deterioration. Tropical ulcers had consumed feet and legs to the point where walking required assistance that fellow prisoners were too weak to provide. Malaria had progressed through multiple cycles until fever responses had exhausted their victims' ability to regulate basic physiological functions. Reed examined the medical logs that captured Japanese units had maintained until their final weeks of organized existence. The handwriting deteriorated progressively from precise military records to barely legible scrawl that recorded the systematic collapse of human physiology under tropical conditions that American forces had learned to neutralize with chemical prophylaxis and systematic vector control. Unit strength reports showed companies reduced to squad size, then to individual survivors who could no longer be considered effective military personnel by any reasonable standard of combat readiness. The captured Japanese medical officer, who spoke broken English, described conditions that amounted to biological warfare, in which the environment had allied itself with American forces against an enemy that lacked the industrial capacity to fight microscopic opponents. His unit had maintained 30 men hospitalized for every 100 men on the organizational chart during the final months of 1944, with hospital areas that resembled refugee camps more than military medical facilities. Treatment consisted of whatever plant materials local knowledge suggested might provide symptomatic relief, administered by medics who were themselves too sick to perform basic medical procedures with any reliability. Reed walked through the abandoned Japanese defensive positions and observed the physical evidence of medical collapse written across terrain that should have provided formidable obstacles to American advancement. Bunkers contained weapons that showed no signs of recent use, not because their operators had been killed in combat, but because tropical diseases had reduced them to conditions that made weapons handling impossible. Ammunition caches remained untouched because the soldiers assigned to use them had been evacuated to medical facilities where they waited to die from diseases that proper prophylaxis could have prevented entirely. The intelligence data Reed compiled painted a picture of military dissolution that exceeded the most optimistic American projections for enemy degradation under tropical conditions. The Japanese 18th Army had begun operations in November 1942 with approximately 140,000 men organized into combat-effective divisions capable of sustained offensive operations against fortified American positions. By June 1944, effective strength had fallen to fewer than 20,000 men capable of performing basic military duties, with the remainder distributed among medical facilities, burial details, and evacuation routes that led nowhere because transportation capacity had been destroyed by Allied interdiction and disease attrition among support personnel. Reed's medical assessment documented the contrast between American and Japanese approaches to biological warfare that neither side had initially recognized as the decisive factor in Pacific theater operations. American infantry divisions now reported malaria incidence rates below 30 cases per 1,000 men per annum, maintaining aggregate strength levels above 90% despite operating in environmental conditions that had historically rendered military operations impossible for extended periods. Japanese units in identical geographic areas showed incidence rates in the thousands per 1,000, meaning individual soldiers contracted malaria multiple times while their units disintegrated around them. The captured Japanese supply records that Reed examined revealed the logistical catastrophe that had preceded and accelerated medical disaster throughout enemy-controlled areas. Rations had declined from normal peacetime levels to fewer than 900 calories per day, insufficient to sustain basic metabolic functions under the energy demands imposed by tropical heat and humidity. Medical supplies consisted primarily of traditional remedies that provided no protection against malaria, dysentery, or tropical infections that thrived in unsanitary conditions created by overcrowding in improvised medical facilities that lacked basic drainage or waste disposal systems. Reed interviewed Japanese prisoners who described the progressive breakdown of military discipline as physical deterioration made normal command relationships impossible to maintain. Officers who could barely walk could not lead men who could barely stand. Units that existed on organizational charts had no physical presence in defensive positions, because their personnel lay unconscious in medical areas where treatment meant little more than providing shelter from rain and insects, while men waited to die from diseases that had been preventable with proper supplies and systematic application of medical knowledge. The final intelligence summary that Reed submitted to Pacific Theater headquarters contained casualty figures that redefined the nature of victory in tropical warfare. 79% of the Japanese 18th Army had not survived the war, with the vast majority of casualties resulting from disease and starvation rather than combat action. American forces had achieved strategic dominance through the systematic application of industrial chemistry and medical discipline rather than through superior firepower or tactical innovation. The enemy had been defeated by opponents too small to see, but powerful enough to reduce elite military formations to collections of patients who posed no threat to anyone. Reed stood on Cape Wam Beach on August 15, 1945, watching the formal surrender ceremony that marked the end of organized Japanese resistance in New Guinea. The 13,000 surviving members of the 18th Army who participated in surrender procedures represented less than 10% of the force that had begun operations 3 years earlier with confidence in their ability to defeat American forces through superior discipline and tactical expertise. The jungle had chosen sides in this war, and victory belonged to whoever could survive its microscopic armies long enough to occupy the territory they defended. The graves that stretched inland from the beach contained the remains of soldiers who had died not from bullets or artillery, but from diseases that American Medical Corps officers had learned to prevent with yellow pills and chemical spray. Reed realized that he had witnessed the transformation of warfare itself, the emergence of biological competition as a strategic factor that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns without a shot being fired. The Pacific War had been won as much in pharmaceutical laboratories and chemical plants as on traditional battlefields where conventional weapons decided tactical outcomes that biology had already predetermined. Reed sat in the visitors' lounge of the Marine Corps Veterans Home in Quantico during the summer of 1976, watching young corpsmen practice medical procedures that had evolved directly from lessons learned in Pacific jungles 34 years earlier. The institutional memory lived in training manuals that codified tropical medicine as essential combat doctrine, but Reed knew the real story lay in numbers that most of these young Marines would never see. His battalion's hospitalization days had dropped from 520 per thousand man days to 120 within 6 months of implementing strict prophylaxis protocols in 1943, while Japanese units in identical conditions showed no such improvement until their medical collapse became complete. The modern Marine Corps medical training that Reed observed through the lounge windows reflected the systematic integration of lessons that had been learned through trial and catastrophic error during the early months of Pacific operations. Recruits learned to treat anti-malarial prophylaxis with the same seriousness they applied to weapons maintenance, understanding that disease prevention represented a force multiplier equivalent to superior firepower or tactical advantage. The yellow pills that had once seemed like an experimental intrusion into traditional military doctrine now formed part of basic military knowledge that every Marine carried into tropical deployments across Southeast Asia and beyond. Reed's memories crystallized around specific moments that had defined the transformation of American military medicine from peacetime theory to wartime necessity. He recalled standing in the intelligence tent at Henderson Field in September 1942, examining aerial photographs that showed Japanese defensive positions gradually emptying as disease reduced enemy units to medical emergencies rather than military threats. The strategic implications had become clear not through abstract analysis, but through direct observation of enemy collapse that preceded any major American offensive operations. The Veterans Home Library contained Army medical histories that documented the scope of biological warfare that neither side had initially recognized as the decisive factor in Pacific theater operations. 47,663 malaria cases in the Southwest Pacific area during 1943 alone, but those raw numbers concealed the crucial distinction between American units that maintained medical discipline and enemy forces that lacked the industrial capacity to implement systematic disease prevention. Reed had watched American divisions sustain 90% strength levels, while Japanese armies dissolved into collections of patients who could not defend territory they no longer possessed the physical ability to occupy. The technological legacy of Pacific medical operations lived in pharmaceutical production capabilities that had been created to meet wartime demand for anti-malarial drugs and insecticides on an industrial scale. Winthrop Chemical Company's production lines that had manufactured 2.5 billion atabrine doses in 1944 now produced anti-malarial drugs for civilian public health programs that applied military medical doctrine to disease control in tropical regions worldwide. DDT production facilities that had supplied American forces with chemical weapons against mosquito populations now supported global malaria eradication programs that treated disease prevention as a strategic priority comparable to national defense. Reed examined medical journals that analyzed Pacific theater operations through the lens of modern epidemiological knowledge, recognizing patterns that had been invisible to commanders who focused on conventional military metrics, while biological warfare determined strategic outcomes through processes that operated below the threshold of tactical awareness. American forces had achieved victory through the systematic application of industrial chemistry to tropical disease control, creating conditions that allowed sustained military operations in environmental conditions that had historically rendered large-scale warfare impossible for extended periods. The Korean War Medical War. Records that Reed reviewed in the Veterans Home Archives showed direct applications of Pacific theater lessons to new operational environments, where disease control remained essential for maintaining combat effectiveness. American units deployed to tropical and subtropical regions now implemented prophylaxis protocols as standard procedure, treating medical discipline as fundamental military competence rather than specialized knowledge reserved for medical personnel. The institutional learning that had emerged from Pacific operations had been codified into doctrine that treated biological warfare as seriously as conventional combat operations. Reed's conversations with younger veterans who had served in Vietnam revealed the continued relevance of lessons learned during Pacific operations, as American forces operating in tropical environments still depended on systematic disease prevention to maintain the strength levels necessary for sustained combat operations. Malaria prophylaxis remained standard procedure for American troops deployed to regions where mosquito-borne diseases posed strategic threats to military effectiveness. The yellow pills that had saved American forces in the Pacific continued to protect American soldiers in Southeast Asian jungles, where environmental conditions replicated the biological challenges that had destroyed Japanese armies 30 years earlier. The memorial service that Reed attended for his former commanding officer, Major General Alexander Vandegrift, provided an opportunity to reflect on the strategic transformation that had emerged from tactical necessity during the early months of Pacific operations. Vandegrift had recognized that disease control represented a force multiplier that could determine campaign outcomes through processes that operated independently of conventional military action. His insistence on medical discipline as essential combat readiness had created conditions that allowed American forces to sustain operations while their opponents collapsed from biological causes that proper preparation could have prevented. Reed walked through the Quantico Cemetery where marble headstones marked the graves of Marines who had survived Pacific operations to die decades later from natural causes rather than tropical diseases that had killed thousands of their enemies during the war. The contrast spoke to strategic advantages that had been achieved through systematic application of scientific knowledge to military problems that conventional wisdom had considered unsolvable. American forces had learned to treat the microscopic battlefield as seriously as conventional combat, creating capabilities that had decided the outcome of entire campaigns without firing shots that would appear in traditional military histories. The final entry in Reed's personal journal, written on the 34th anniversary of the Guadalcanal landing, contained reflections that summarized the transformation of warfare itself during Pacific operations. American victory had resulted from the systematic integration of industrial chemistry, medical discipline, and logistical coordination into military doctrine that treated disease prevention as essential combat capability. The enemy had been defeated not through superior firepower or tactical innovation, but through the application of scientific knowledge to biological competition that had operated as a parallel war within the conventional military conflict. Reed closed his journal and watched the sunset over Quantico's parade ground, remembering dawn at Henderson Field when he had counted yellow pills in his palm while mosquitoes hummed in the darkness beyond the Marine perimeter. The war had been won with tablets and spray cans as much as with rifles and artillery, through victories achieved in pharmaceutical laboratories and chemical plants, rather than on traditional battlefields where conventional weapons decided outcomes that biology had already predetermined. The Pacific had taught American forces that preparedness meant more than ammunition and fuel. It meant mastery of enemies too small to see, but powerful enough to determine the fate of empires.